taken captive, to captivity he goes. If anyone is to be slain with the sword he must be slain. Here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints. We ended last time looking at that passage and its background in Jeremiah 15. We saw that God actually uses in Jeremiah 15 Babylon to bring judgment upon kind of the visible church, right? The visible manifestation of God's people. And that while there's many people who are faithful amongst God's people, the majority were unfaithful. And so not just the unfaithful, but both the unfaithful and the faithful would receive suffering and the application of the covenant curse, but also later on in chapter 16, a promise that God would restore them from that exile. We see here that John is using this language in the context of the state persecution of God's people, whether it be a political, institutional, but human power institutionalized, so to speak, through nations, governments, states. When it's applied, we are to understand that even though it might to the outside world, to the outside unbelieving world, look like we are the one who are cursed, we are the one under some kind of divine judgment, that we're actually faithfully testifying to a different kingdom. Right? You think about sometimes the negative impression the world receives or has when we bear faithful witness to the gospel, and then perhaps we suffer for it. And the world can easily look at that and say, see, that's why they're wrong. Right? That's why they're on the wrong side of history. This is why they're suffering, because their God is not the true God. They ought to get on the right side of history, right? And believe the right things, right? Embrace the message of love, whatever that is defined today. So it's very easy to see how our faithfulness can even look like we're under divine curse when we receive persecution, because we haven't stepped in line with kind of the world system of the belief in the power of the beast. And so we see that our faithfulness, again, is not marked by armed conflict. It's not marked by violent resistance, but rather a persistent witness to the reality of the presence of the kingdom already through his risen Son and manifested in the church, his people. We see following that the vision of the second beast, which is a kind of what also known as the false prophet later on in the book of Revelation. And here we see kind of, again, human culture kind of banding together to proclaim and to promote the magnificence and supremacy and the unsurpassedness of the first beast. So again, this is kind of the false prophet trying to compel and deceive people with a message of religious fidelity to that first beast. So here we see kind of humanity in its civil institutions and humanity in its kind of social religious institutions kind of working together, these two beasts, to deceive people into worshiping the dragon, worshiping the beast. Now we're kind of just doing a little bit of review here. This is followed then with three angels in chapter 14, who are then given an eternal gospel to proclaim. And this gospel, again, if we're familiar with this term gospel, we often think about the word gospel as meaning something like, this is how one becomes a Christian. Right? This is how one is saved. Right? You think about maybe the Romans road. You think about maybe the 5 spiritual laws. Right? You've heard a lot of different types of kind of canned gospel presentations. But the term here, gospel, is probably a lot more closer to its original context, where it means something like the declaration of a royal ascension. The term gospel in the first century means something like a king has been victorious, or a king has ascended to the throne. So gospel is really something more like a royal announcement in its kind of core meaning of the term. And the way that it's being used here, sometimes it's been mistaken as this is kind of a last-ditch effort to kind of offer the gospel and offer a chance for people to repent. But when you look at what these three angels are describing, you look at, and kind of a summary here, these first, second, and third angels, the content of what they're proclaiming is thoroughgoing judgment. There's really nothing kind of an offer of salvation here, any kind of beckon to repent. It's all just a declaration of judgment. And this is likely because both this fifth vision and the sixth vision are kind of the penultimate declaration that God has both judged the earth and that he's going to vindicate his people. And so here with these three angels proclaiming these judgments, they're proclaiming God's kind of final, irrevocable judgment, first on unbelieving humanity. That's the first angel in verses 6 through 7 of chapter 14. Then with the second angel upon Babylon, which we'll see is kind of a figure used for kind of human socio-economic culture. We'll see that more so in chapter 17. But basically, unbelieving humanity, its cultural center, and then third, the angel proclaims final judgment upon the allies of the beast, namely those spiritual forces that lie behind unbelieving humanity and its culture and fallen institutions. And then, in light of this kind of proclamation of judgment, there's an exhortation to discern in their judgment the vindication of the saints' suffering and persecution. In other words, the author John here is calling the reader to see God judging or kind of proclaiming irrevocable coming judgment upon unbelieving humanity, upon its fallen culture, and upon the spiritual forces that underlie it, to be encouraged by their vindication. Remember, back in earlier in chapter, I believe, we're looking at chapter 6, we see a vision of the saints crying out to God from underneath the altar, when will you vindicate us? Right? When will you vindicate us from the unjust suffering and persecution that we experience as a result of our faithful witness? And here we see that in the angels proclaiming this kind of irrevocable, inevitable judgment upon unbelieving humanity, its culture, and the spiritual forces underlying it. The readers to see that and be encouraged because vindication is assured. God will vindicate us from the unjust suffering that we experience as a result of our faithful witness and testimony to God's kingdom. Right? This is something that cannot be avoided. When we read through the prophetic corpus, there's places in the prophets, like in Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah, where after a number of different warnings that God gives through his prophets, there's a kind of hinge point where ultimately then judgment is unavoidable. Right? It's coming. There's nothing that can be done to avoid it. And here with these three angels, you have something like that being communicated. That these three angels, in their proclamation, in their declaration of an eternal gospel, and that's the point, right? Because it's an eternal royal proclamation and announcement, it cannot be undone. It cannot be reversed. That God, in taking up his consummate rule and reign, means that equally the judgment of fallen humanity, its fallen culture, and the spiritual forces underlying it are irrevocably condemned and issued for and prepared for judgment. Now, the converse to this image here, after these three angels, is another set of three angels that follow a figure that is probably likely Christ, one that's described here as one like the Son of Man with a golden crown on his head. So we see that this kind of figure is again bringing up to our visage the same image of the Son of Man, the same of Christ that we saw back in chapter 5. We saw kind of the vision of the Lamb, one like a Son of Man with a golden crown on his head. And we see here that after this Son of Man figure, we have three more angels come out to administer this end time harvest. And we see here that we have two harvests being described. In verses 15 and 14, we have the Son of Man coming out, and then we have an angel coming out of the temple as well, calling to this Son of Man figure to put his sickle and reap. Right? And then we have another succession of two figures, two angels, one that comes out of the temple in heaven, and also one that comes out of the altar, who had authority over the fire, in verses 17 and 18. And these two angels, again, this second angel calls the first angel to put their sickle out and to reap. And then the earth is reaped. So we have these two harvests being described at the end of chapter 14. Now, what's being described here? Again, this is coming on the heels of these 7 visions. And just like the other cycle of 7s that we've seen throughout this book, that it's the 6th and 7th kind of, the 6th and 7th segment that usually describes the final judgment. If you go back to the seals, if you go back to the trumpets, the first set of 5 usually describe what God is doing during the inner Advent age, either allowing suffering to purify his people or allowing suffering to judge unbelief. But then in the 6th and 7th segment, whether it's the seals or the trumpets, we have the final judgment being described in certain ways. Here we see something similar going on. Right? After the first 5 visions that we've seen described, right? After the announcement of God's irrevocable, unavoidable judgment being declared as an eternal gospel, in the 6th and 7th vision, we have a vision or kind of perspectives on the final judgment. Right? With these 2 harvests, we see the judgment of unbelief. And with the 7th vision that follows it, the saints singing the song of Moses by the glass sea, we have a vision of what's true of the saints. So if you kind of think about this picture, right, you have the Son of Man and his kind of angelic band harvesting the earth in judgment, while at the same time the saints are singing by the glass sea. Now, if you remember in a few weeks back, when's the last time that we saw the glass sea being described in Revelation? Do you remember that? It's back in chapter 5, right? When we have the vision of God on the throne and the Lamb who was slain. And the saints are seen there in that picture, what? By the glass sea in the presence of the throne room. So with the saints here singing along the glass sea, they are singing the song of Moses, the song of deliverance, in the very throne room presence of God. Right? While kind of subsequently to the Son of Man kind of harvesting the earth in the context of judgment. So that's what's being kind of described here in the 6th and 7th vision that we see here in chapters 14 and 15. Now, to come back to chapter 14, the question sometimes comes to, why are there 2 harvests? Notice that what we see here, we have 2 harvests being described. And some might look at this chapter and think, well, why would you have 2 harvests if they're both judgment? Perhaps one of these harvests is the harvest of believers. God is harvesting, in one sense, believers from the earth, and then afterwards, then he's harvesting people for judgment. Clearly, if we kind of take that approach, it's almost undeniable that that second harvest is one of judgment. If you look at that text for a moment, look at chapter 14, verses 17 and following. Read there for a moment. Let me just kind of ask you, what about this harvest makes it very clear that this is a harvest of judgment? Anything in the text that kind of pops out to you that clearly this has to be a harvest that's a harvest for judgment?
It was carried out by an angel who was in control.
Yeah, it's carried by out by an angel, but the angel could be harvesting believers, right? So,
Well, yeah, but the first harvest was carried out by God. The second harvest was carried out by Satan.
well, do you see Satan in the text there?
It's the good versus evil.
Yeah, if that's the case, if it's both kind of good versus evil. And what I want to put out there is there's 2 ways of reading this text. Some folk would say that the first harvest is for believers and the second harvest is for unbelievers. And then others would read this to these 2 harvests actually both describing a harvest of judgment. And so both those views understand that the second harvest is a harvest of judgment. The only difference between the 2 views is that one view sees it as the first one as a harvest of believers, whereas the second one is a harvest of judgment. So this kind of as a reading experiment, I wanted to kind of ask you, what do we probably can see here in the second harvest that both these views see as a harvest of judgment?
Authority over fire.
Authority over fire, so there's the presence of fire, often associated with judgment. Yeah.
Verse 19, the winepress of the wrath of God.
The winepress of the wrath of God. That's a very concrete image from the prophetic corpus, describing God's end-time judgment of unbelievers, right? Never something applied to believers. There's that kind of winepress image. We also see it coupled with this idea of fire, right? Fire in the context, often judgment. Now, notice, do we have that imagery repeated in the first harvest? What are some of the elements that are part of that first harvest, if we were going to describe it? Right, Christ, because the Son of Man is seen with a golden crown on his head. He's told to put in his sickle, for the hour to reap has come, and the harvest of the earth is fully ripe. So we don't have the winepress. We still have that kind of ripeness imagery, right? And so he who sat on the clouds swung his sickle across the earth, and the earth was reaped. So not a whole lot of detail that like we see in the second harvest. We simply see the fact that this harvest is being carried out by the Son of Man who wears the crown on his head. So the question is, what's going on here? Are these two different harvests, or are they two kind of images describing the same type of harvest? And one thing that might be helpful here is that when the angel tells this figure to put in his sickle, he's actually alluding to Joel 3:13. If you turn there in your Bibles for a moment, Joel 3:13. This is actually the passage that's being alluded to here in this text, describing this end-time harvest judgment. Joel 3, verse 13 and following. So if we turn there, beginning in verse 13 of chapter 3, this is the Lord judging the nations here in the context. And he says this, "Put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Go in, tread, for the winepress is full. The vats overflow, for their evil is great. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near, the valley of decision." So here, notice that both these harvests are alluding to Joel 3:13 here. You notice that? Right? They're both using this phrase, put in the sickle and reap. But we know that from Joel 3:13 and following, is there two different harvests there? No, it's just one. And it's clearly in Joel 3:13 that the harvest is focused on judgment. Right? Everybody see that? So then what, if these are two different harvests, one good, one bad, why would both be alluding to Joel 3:13? It would seem to be the case is that if both harvests are meant to be modeled after Joel 3:13, that both are actually describing the same end-time judgment of the nations. So if that's the case, and that makes it kind of problematic to see the first harvest as a harvest of believers, whereas the second harvest is a harvest of unbelievers for judgment. Now, kind of the converse is say, well, wait a minute, if that's the case, if we have two harvests, why two? Why not just simply have one? Okay, I'll get to your question in a second. When we look at this text, notice that the first harvest is focusing on Christ's royal authority. Right? This is his harvest in light of his kind of reign and rule as the king of creation. Right? In response to the rebellion of unbelieving humanity, this harvest is being undertaken. In other words, the harvest that's first pictured is a harvest of those who are in rebellion to God's end-time rule and reign. That's why the focus here is on his crown on his head. That's the only detail that we have about this first harvest. But the second harvest is associated with the fire and with the winepress of God. Now we know that the winepress of God is an image of judgment, but why is this idea of fire mentioned? Generally, we've seen it associated with judgment, but in the context of the narrative revelation, where would we have seen angels administering or handling fire, especially coming out from the temple? When's the last time we saw angels handling fire in the presence within the temple complex? Anybody remember? Remember back with the kind of different angels, a few in the trumpet judgments. Very end, they're handling the bowls of judgments. The very end of the trumpets, they're seen as handling the bowls of fire, and taking that fire from where? The altar, under from which what? The saints were crying for vindication. And we know that, so the fire from the altar, which represents the prayers of the saints, the cries of vindication, that fire is being taken and put into the bowls and now administered to, in the bowl judgments, for judgment, vindication of God's people suffering as a result of persecution. So here we see the angels administering this fire in the context of this harvest. Why a second harvest? While the first harvest kind of demonstrated and symbolized the Son of Man judging those in rebellion to him, the second harvest is representing God's judgment in vindicating their persecution of the saints. So if you think about why we have these two harvests, one is focused on their just judgment in light of this rule of the Son of Man. They're rebels against his sovereignty. The second harvest is representing their judgment as just in light of their persecution of the saints. That the fire of the altar, representing the prayers of the saints, is now being finally and fully applied in judgment of their persecution and oppression of God's people. So this kind of harvest is twofold. It's in response to the rebellion, and it's in response to their persecution of God's people. And it's this kind of picture of the judgment that's seen as kind of the full kind of demonstration of God's justice against his sovereignty and against for the vindication of his people. And it's on the tail of this particular vision that we see the saints singing a song of new deliverance in the wake of this picture of the harvest. They're singing again along the sea of glass with harps of God in their hands, singing the song of Moses, the song of deliverance and redemption. And this kind of ends that cycle of the 7 visions of deep conflict. Let me just take a quick question. Yeah, was a question over here? Or maybe we can come back to it. I'm sorry, can you speak up a little bit? I can't hear you. One's a what? A magistrate? Can you kind of unpack what you mean by that? Yeah, I would say no, because the image... In Job 3, 13 and 14, it makes sense because he want to protect people that are faithful to God, and then judge those that are still rebelling. Yeah, I understand kind of the sentiment behind that, but I don't think that's what he's doing in this particular vision. I think if we want to see God protecting and preserving his people, he's kind of made that point in earlier parts of Revelation. Whereas now here in this particular vision, we don't necessarily have to pack in all of our theology into one particular vision. We can allow the vision to speak in concert with all of the other visions that have made different theological points at different times. So I think we can focus on one particular vision that seems to be focused on this idea of judgment of unbelief.
What chapter of Revelation will we talk about? 14?
Yeah, we're looking at chapter 14, right, with the vision of this 3 angels, and with the Son of Man here in chapter 14. Yeah. All right. Any other questions? Just what we've covered here. Yes.
I'm just wondering about the imagery of the winepress and the grapes and the vine.
Yeah.
Why is that used? Usually I think of God or Christ being the vine and we are the branches and the fruit. You know, if it's not a judgment on believers, like you say,
Yeah.
it's the other. Why is he interjecting these symbols or these words.
Yeah. And I think it's because when he talks about the winepress, he's actually pulling it from Joel 3:14. It's actually the exact kind of wording verbatim. So while we can talk about Israel as God's pleasant planting, right? We can talk about Christ, how Christ is the vine and we are the branches. In that context, in the Gospels, he's actually alluding to Isaiah 5, where God had planted a vine and looked for fruit from that vine, but saw that there was no fruit. So when Jesus in the Gospel says that I am the vine and you are the branches, he's saying, I'm actually the true root of Israel, and you are my fruit, that you're actually bearing fruit, as opposed to how Israel in the past had been rebellion against God and had not bearing fruit. But because he's the true vine, right? He is the kind of true Israel. We are the fruit of his kind of end time blessing. Yeah. So there it's Isaiah 5, but here clearly the wording is coming from Joel 3:14, which is a picture of end time judgment. Right? So again, it's the Old Testament imagery that wants to kind of guide our interpretation here. We can come up with a lot of different ideas. We just kind of impose our own ideas in text. But what we want to do is kind of take the Old Testament imagery and see what John's doing with that imagery and let that guide our interpretation. Did I see a hand over here? Yeah?
I just want to point out, it says in Revelation 14, verse 17, then another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sword. Do we consider the angels still being children of God?
No, they wouldn't be children of God. The angels are created beings specifically for the purposes of communicating these spiritual realities. So the angels are not any kind of progeny of God, any kind of earthly sense. The angels here are simply representative of God's administration of his power and justice in the context of these visions. All right, let's kind of move forward here a little bit here. So from...
It also says in Isaiah 63, it talks about the one passing and trying in his anger with the people.
Exactly. Right? So it's not just Joel 3, right? We can look at other passages that uses this winepress imagery to talk about end-time judgment of unbelievers. Yeah. All right, let's kind of shift forward a little bit here. So coming from the 7 visions here, if you go to our next kind of handout, we come to the kind of next 2 major sections of the book, which are the 7 bowls and the final judgment of Babylon and the beast. Let's see here. Kind of just pick this up here. All right. Now, with the 7 bowls here, I want to kind of distinguish these from the other 2 sets of 7s that we've seen so far. Whereas the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets were administering kind of the sovereignty and power and kind of purpose of the heavenly throne room in chapters 4 and 5, the bowl judgments are seen here in response to the 7 visions of deep conflict. Now that's why actually when you kind of read the beginning of chapter 16, that these 7 bowls kind of culminate in the judgment of both Babylon and the beast. Because these bowls are, in a sense, administering God's judgment against unbelievers as devotees of these kind of spiritual figures. So kind of help you to distinguish it a little bit here. Notice that the 7 bowls and the 7 trumpets have an extreme amount of parallelism. So much so that people think that they actually are modeling the same event. I think that's actually the case. That notice that each one of these bowls and trumpets have a corresponding or analogous application of the same or similar plague. They're being applied to the same elements or the same kind of images here, right? The first bowl and the first trumpet are both applied to the earth. The second bowl and the second trumpet are applied to the seas. The third bowl and the third trumpet are applied to the rivers and fountains. And then here we see the fourth bowl being applied to the sun and other cosmic bodies. We see this clear parallelism between the trumpets and the bowls. And the question then becomes, if these are describing the same judgments, then why repeat them? Right? Notice that if the 7 trumpets were kind of focusing on the fate of unbelievers, if the same thing is going on here with the bowls, then why did John repeat them? Now, some have kind of surmised that because when you look at the bowls, that the judgment and destruction that's being applied is total, whereas the judgment and destruction that's being described by the trumpets is partial, that perhaps the trumpets are describing God's kind of allowing of suffering and judgment during the inner Advent age, but that the 7 bowls are something else afterwards, maybe all describing something happening sometime in the future. They're not describing any kind of judgment that God is placing upon unbelief during the inter-Advent age. Now, one thing I want to point out here is that there's a clear distinction between the partialness of the trumpets and the fullness of the 7 bowls. But I don't think it's because there's a difference in time. If there was, why are there's extreme amount of parallelism? And again, we want to realize that these are 2 different cycles of 7s that are attached to 2 different visions. So we want to recognize that the partialness in the trumpets has to do with the fact that not all of the world is equally touched by the suffering and difficulties and trials that God allows to fall upon the earth. But that certain parts of the earth will experience things more than others. But they're all allowances of God to, again, harden unbelief and to bring judgment upon it. Here, the fullness of these judgments for the bowls is likely attached to who they're being applied and how they're being described. Notice in the beginning of chapter 16 how it begins. When you look at chapter 16, in the beginning of the bowl judgments, it's described in the following way. Then I heard a loud voice from the temple telling the 7 angels, "Go and pour out on the earth the 7 bowls of the wrath of God." So again, here's where that connection between the bowls and the 7 visions occurs. Right? What 7 angels is he talking about? He's talking about the 7 angels we just heard about at the very end of these 7 visions. Right? The 7 angels that proclaimed the eternal gospel and that administered the end time harvest. So there's kind of an interlocking here between the vision and the bowls here. So these bowls are attached to, or still kind of part of the kind of visual universe of these 7 visions. And notice what these 7 angels do. Verse 2. So the first angel went and poured out his bowl on the earth, and harmful and painful sores came upon the people who bore the mark of the beast and worshipped its image. See, here unbelievers are being framed now, not in context of their persecution of God's people, but now the unbelieving world is being framed as devotees of the kind of trans-temporal beast that rules over the kingdoms of this world. In other words, that these people who are marked by the image of the beast are not a certain set of people within a certain time, but this is unbelieving humanity throughout redemptive history. So that's why there's a total picture here. There's no partialness here. The focus isn't on kind of the partial kind of administration of God's judgment. Rather, this is a focus on that God is judging totally and completely the beast, the false prophet, Babylon, and the dragon that inspires them. And because God is providing a total judgment upon these spiritual figures, that same total judgment is going to be preceded by the total judgment of their devotees. So that's why there's a difference here between the total or complete nature of the bowls and the trumpets. Whereas pain and suffering is only partially applied and experienced by humanity, either preserving God's people or making permanent when God's judgment of them. Here we see that because the bowls are being applied in the context of the vision of these kind of deep figures of conflict, they're kind of the total nature is being applied to these judgments as well. So what's being described here, if you kind of look at your outline, these 7 bowl judgments are punishing the ungodly during the inner Advent age and constantly at the last day because of their persecution and idolatry. Where the focus of the first 5 bowls is a judgment against the ungodly because of their idolatry and because of their earthly security that they derive from their idolatrous behavior. So we look at the same kind of things are being judged here. We saw in the trumpets, whether it was their security that they get from commerce or trade upon the seas, whether it's their earthly security and resources that they get from rivers and fountains, and also the security that they get from the general political security that you have through different governments and agencies and things like that. We see now judgment being applied to all of these areas of human experience and life. And these all culminate in kind of the last 2 bowl judgments here in the 6th and 7th bowl judgment. And I want to kind of camp down here in these 2 for a moment and read these with you. So look at the 5th and 6th bowl here, beginning in chapter 16, verse 10. We see that the 5th angel poured out his bowl on the throne of the beast, and its kingdom was plunged into darkness. People gnawed their tongues in anguish and cursed the God of heaven for their pain and swords. They did not repent of their deeds. So again, it's refraining this idea that in the face of these judgments, they are hardened in their unbelief. And then the 6th judgment here. The 6th angel poured his bowl out on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up, to prepare the way for the kings from the east. And I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, 3 unclean spirits like frogs. For they are demonic spirits, performing signs, who go abroad to the kings of the whole world to assemble them for the battle on the great day of God the Almighty. Behold, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake, keeping his garments on, that he may not go about naked and be seen and exposed. And they assembled them at the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. Now there's a few different imageries I want to kind of highlight here. Notice that when the 6th angel pours out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, this is anticipating God's judgment against Babylon. You recall that the major feature that Cyrus used to destroy Babylon back in the 6th century was to drain the Euphrates before laying siege to Babylon. And this same kind of judgment is now being re-narrated here for kind of what we see here, cosmic Babylon. Right? While the historical Babylon was equally judged in this way, right? Babylon, this figure in Revelation, is also going to be similarly judged. Now, what does that mean by draining the great river Euphrates? Now, for ancient Babylon, the Euphrates was a massive economic engine. It was a major channel through which Babylon amassed an immense amount of wealth. As Babylon conquered neighboring nations and regions, the Euphrates was the kind of major vein that could channel and kind of travel the resources and the treasure, right, and the wealth of the conquered nations back to Babylon. So when Babylon is described in Jeremiah as Babylon upon many waters, or Babylon is described by being surrounded by waters, it's describing not only the nations, but the wealth of those nations pouring into Babylon. So when we see here that the great river Euphrates is being dried up to prepare the way for the kings from the east, this is describing, again, that just like ancient Babylon, right, Revelation's Babylon is going to have its economic resources and its national allies that they've conquered dried up. The former support and the former security that Babylon has received is now going to be dried up before she's ultimately judged. And what we're going to see here is that the draining of Euphrates to allow the kings from the east to come is describing her wealth is going to be, in a sense, drained from her, and the allegiance of the nations that she conquered is also going to be drained from her. In other words, the nations that she formerly conquered are going to be now turning against her. That's the imagery that's being actually introduced here, and is going to be expanded on later in chapter 17. This imagery of the kings from the east, again, is borrowing from the imagery of judgment oracles that are applied to Israel, where the forces that would invade Israel would come from the east. But now, instead of being applied to Israel, this imagery is now being applied to Babylon. Her resources are draining, her allied nations are abandoning her, and now she's about to be attacked from the kings of the east. In other words, her former allies are now turning on her and are now kind of engorge themselves with her. In other words, you have kind of international conflict being described here. And we see here in verse 13, this allows the dragon, out of the mouth of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet, unclean spirits like frogs to kind of go forward. Now, that's a really strange image, isn't it? What's going on with these frogs, right? Very strange indeed. What's going on with these frogs, again, it's a continuation of the curses and judgments that are applied back to Egypt when Israel came out of exile. So actually the one curse that hasn't been described yet. So both in the trumpets and the bowls, all those different judgments are just kind of reapplications of this kind of curse imagery from the Exodus. But here, we see the frogs being applied. Now, why the frogs? Again, why the frogs? Could have chosen a lot of different curses. Why these? Notice what's being pictured. Euphrates is drying up. Babylon is about to be sacked. And now the dragon is using these demonic frog spirit demons, I know that's strange, isn't it, to amass kind of all the remaining nations for an end-time war. Why are these demons figured like frogs? Frogs were kind of associated with the Egyptian deity of Kemet, which was, I believe, the god of resurrection. And here with resurrection. And so these frogs are kind of a ironic judgment upon Babylon and upon the surrounding nations, that while she's actually experiencing kind of ultimate death, the frogs are going to deceive the nations that she's going to rise again if they amass themselves to reestablish for a final war against God's people and against his anointed. So here the demonic spirits, like frogs, are deceptive kind of agents, deceiving the nations that at Babylon's fall and at her kind of ultimate death, that they can amass the nations to kind of reestablish kind of the sovereignty of fallen humanity that was kind of questioned by Babylon's fall. So, in other words, these frogs are kind of giving the false hope of a resurrection of sorts. That in the wake of Babylon's defeat, human sovereignty, human unbelieving culture can be resurrected if we have this final battle against God and his agents. And that's exactly what they're being assembled for, is their task is to assemble them for battle on the great day of God the Almighty. That's their task. In fact, that's what we see later on described in chapter 19, a similar kind of gathering for the great war on the day of God the Almighty. And here they're being figured here as being described as being gathered at a place called Armageddon. Now, why is this significant? It's not going to be significant for its literal description. Some readers might see this as that, actually, no, it's going to take place in this particular location outside of Israel. That it's not a figurative description of the place of the final judgment. Why? Because there is actually a place called Megiddo. Right? This is talking about the mountain of Megiddo, or the Mount of Megiddo. That's actually how Armageddon or Armageddon is translated in Hebrew. And so the assumption is, okay, well, the last battle is going to happen at Megiddo. The problem is that there's no mountain in Megiddo. Right? If you ever go to Megiddo, it's a little small hill, right? No big mountain. So why is it being called Mount Megiddo here? And in fact, when you go back through the Old Testament, major battles in Israel's kind of initial history happened in the plain or location of Megiddo. And here, this last great battle happening at the Mount of Megiddo is that place where the final agents of God's enemies are going to try to resurrect kind of the great mountain that is Babylon. Where Babylon was previously figured as a great mountain and other kind of nations figured as mountains, this is a last-ditch effort of God's enemies and unbelieving humanity to once again resurrect this great mountain that reaches up into the sky, Babylon. Here at Mount Megiddo, this kind of classic location of battle between God's people and the surrounding nations. So here it's this final place of conflict that God is going to judge the rebellion of sinful humanity. And that's exactly what we see in the seventh bowl vision, right? We see the seventh angel pouring out his bowl into the air, and we see all the different features and trappings of end-time judgment. Lightning, rumblings, great earthquake. And notice what it says here, how it's describing what's the product of this end-time earthquake. Verse 19, the great city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And God remembered Babylon the Great to make her drain the cup of the wine of the fury of his wrath. And every island fled away, and no mountains were to be found. So this is why it's called Mount Megiddo. It's the last attempt to resurrect Babylon, to keep her from going under, so to speak. And here, time and time again, mountains are gone. They fled away, and the great city of Babylon is made to drain the dregs of the wine of God's wrath. And that's kind of where we see the bowls ending. And it introduces us into kind of another interlude vision, where you see the judgment of Babylon in chapter 17 and chapter 18, and the judgment of the beast in chapter 19. We'll have to pick that up next week before we get into the millennium. We'll see you then. Thank you so much. Yeah. So, yeah. Let's see here. Yeah, no, it's, yeah.
I just read it here. I'll put it
Yeah.
in my notes.